Anna Ritchie-Allen, and I am one of the co-chairs of the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls. In my day job, I'm Executive Director of Close the Gap. Thanks so much for your time today. This is going to be our final circle event of Phase 2. Today I'm joined by my fellow co-chair, Talat Yaqub, and other members of the National Advisory Council, some of whom you'll be hearing from today during this event. We're also pleased as ever to be joined by members of the Empowering Women panel who will be delivering a session today. And we're also pleased to be joined by the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Shirley-Anne Somerville, and the Minister for Equalities, Kokab Stewart. And finally, we're really delighted to welcome the Chief Executive of the Runnymede Trust, Shabna Begum, who'll be joining us later on in the session. So this circle event is intended to mark the publication of National Advisory Council's end of Phase 2 report, which was published earlier this week. Phase 2 Advisory Council concludes on the 20th of March, so at the end of this week, and the report that we've just published provides an overview of the activity that we've undertaken over the last almost 4 years. I'll look at the partnership work that we did with the Empowering Women panel and the Scottish Government as part of the development of a national equality strategy for women and girls, the learning on accountability that we wanted to share with other strategic groups and those looking to do accountability work, and finally what we believe a Phase 3 Advisory Council should look like. So this report is available to read on the National Advisory Council website. The National Advisory Council Secretariat will be sharing a link to the report following the event today. Before we kick things off, I just wanted to say thank you to those of you who submitted questions for our speakers in advance of attending today. So that's really helped us shape the event, and we're looking forward to some really interesting discussions. So first of all, I'm going to give an overview of the work that we've done during Phase 2, just briefly for some context. The main focus of Phase 2 was to scrutinise the progress of the recommendations that were made in Phase 1, all of which were accepted by Scottish Government with some degree of action. And we did this work over 4 cycles of scrutiny. Our first focus looked at the 9 recommendations that related to the internal structures, systems and processes within Scottish Government. So the machinery of government, how policy gets made. The second focus of scrutiny was thematic. It coincided with the cost of living crisis, which we know disproportionately affected women, and especially those who were already most marginalised and experiencing poverty. So disabled women, women of colour, migrant women and single parents. We looked at Scottish Government's response to the cost of living crisis. And so it was important to centre intersectional analysis in that. This work was initially separate to recommendation scrutiny, but we found that many of the challenges we identified were aligned with the findings of the scrutiny work we were doing anyway. During this focus, the Empowering Women panel was established and supported us by providing peer research on the lived experience of women and girls in their communities of the cost of living crisis. Following this focus, we published our first report of Phase 2, which included 21 calls to action for Scottish Government. Our third focus of scrutiny looked at the implementation of Advisory Council recommendations on the review of the public sector equality duty and integrating intersectional gender budget analysis in the Scottish budget process. We used care, so social care, childcare and unpaid care as the frame for this work, given how absolutely intrinsic it is to so many women's lives. Following this focus, we published our second report of Phase 2. In our final year, our main focus has been working in partnership with the Empowering Women panel and Scottish Government on developing the equality strategy for women and girls, which we look forward to the publication of. This development was in response to one of our calls to action in our first published report. We identified that a key challenge has persistently been the lack of gender policy coherence that we see across government and elsewhere. And this is in part driven by there being no national strategy for women and girls equality. So we very much welcome this as a positive step forward. In addition to the strategy, over this last year, we've conducted some light touch scrutiny activity on other advisory council recommendations that were focused on childcare, education and justice. And so you can read more about the findings of that work in our report. We've also held 2 facilitated learning sessions over this final year to identify, what we've achieved during that time, but also what are the challenges and what lessons have we learned that we can share. These sessions have also helped to inform what we think should be a phase 3 of the Advisory Council, which we'll touch on later on. The Advisory Council has also worked collaboratively across Scottish Government to influence and enable the embedding of gender competence and intersectional analysis in areas of policy frameworks and decision making. For example, Programme for Government, the National Performance Framework, and the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan, to name a few. So that's a quick overview and some context setting for everyone. I'm now going to hand over to one of our National Advisory Council members, Lily Greenan, who will discuss our key observations that we've highlighted in the report. So over to you, Lily.
Thanks, Anna. Hello, everyone. I'm Lily Greenan, no organisation. Over phase 2, we've worked to bring more of a focus on gender equality and intersectionality across the Scottish Government. Conversations that previously would have taken place just within specialist teams are now appearing in mainstream policy discussions, which is a positive. We know that intersectionality in particular isn't well understood. But we have seen more officials recognising that gender inequality doesn't operate in isolation. It intersects with race, disability, socioeconomic status and other structural inequalities. And that shift hasn't come about by accident. It's come from continuous challenge, evidence and relationship building through the phase 2 process. Visibility is just the first stage. We still have a significant gap between awareness and action. We need deeper and more consistent application of intersectional analysis across all of the Scottish Government directorates. One of the most innovative aspects of the Advisory Council's approach has been the iterative scrutiny model that we adopted during phase 2. So rather than doing a one-off report or a single piece of advice, the Advisory Council returned repeatedly to key issues, challenging some norms and watching how the system responded over time. It's created a level of external oversight that has been persistent and we think constructive. And it showed that advisory groups can do more than simply publish recommendations, which is often the default position. They can actively shape how government thinks, responds, and adapts. This model is perhaps something that other advisory and governance structures could meaningfully adopt if they want to have an influence that extends beyond that single moment in a policy cycle. A further achievement has been building strong relationships with local government partners. Our engagement with COSLA has been especially important, providing a route to engage councils on practical action. And this matters because so much of the change that will actually improve the lives of women and girls happens on the ground. It happens in schools, in communities, and in local services. National policy can set the direction, but local delivery determines the impact. Strengthening the link between national policy and local delivery is an essential step, we believe, in tackling the implementation gap and ensuring that women and girls can access the services that meet their needs. Working with the Empowering Women panel has been a highlight of our work and has provided valuable learning on what ethical participation looks like. They have very generously shared their lived experience, expertise, and held Scottish Government to account through their work. By bringing women with lived experience directly into policy conversations, it shifted the tone, the assumptions, and the priorities in ways that written reports alone just can't do. We saw this particularly clearly in areas like childcare, social care, and unpaid care during the third focus of scrutiny, when the panel's insight really genuinely influenced how the problem was understood. However, while understanding improved, the pace of policy change remained slow. Lived experience can illuminate the issues brilliantly, but the system still struggles to translate that insight into timely action. One of the toughest and most persistent challenges we've had has been building intersectional gender competence within the civil service. While there are early signs of how this can be done, we're yet to see a strategic mechanism to implementing this across Scottish Government so that it's a whole organisation approach. Without structural support, competence building becomes optional. People can go to trainings and the optional work, which is like it can be quickly deprioritized in a pressured policy environment. We took an iterative approach to our scrutiny work. We used a range of tools. We had scrutiny sessions. We did engagement with small teams and individual officials. We wrote questions. We structured challenge. However, few of these strategies delivered progress. So we tried lots of different things, but few of them delivered. What became clear is that senior officials' role design and their responsibilities to ministers greatly constrains their ability to imagine a change process and to invest critical resources, like time and outside expertise, into a change programme for themselves and their teams. Beyond goodwill and warm words, you need clear expectations, you need capacity, you need investment in infrastructure, and you need accountability. Ultimately, if we want long-term systemic change, we need unambiguous leadership from ministers and ideally cross-government commitment at cabinet level matched with adequate resourcing. Gender equality can't be realised by enthusiasm alone. It needs a strategic mandate, prioritisation with ministers championing the work. That kind of leadership is what will turn visibility into action and action into lasting change for women and girls across Scotland. Thank you. I'm now going to pass on to Amanda, who's going to discuss the importance of this work in the current political context.
Thank you very much, Lily, and hello to everyone. My name is Amanda Macy. I'm also a council member in the National Advisory Council. I'm a campaigner and writer about inequalities and a trustee for the Young Women's Movement and a UCL law graduate. And I'm going to talk about the backdrop that underpins the work that we've been trying to do. So over the period of phase two, our work has taken place against an increasing backdrop of growing toxicity within public discourse. We have seen widespread disinformation, increasing online hostility, and a normalization of harmful narratives, many of which target women and other marginalized groups, and more so when they're intersecting factors. And this climate affects policymaking and public attitudes, and it affects the safety and the well-being of the very communities that we've been aiming to support. And evidence clearly shows that misogyny is becoming more visible in schools. For example, in 2024, Zero Tolerance reported increases in sexist and incel-influenced language amongst pupils. And also the Scottish Government's 2023 behaviour in Scottish schools report found that 18% of school staff had witnessed sexist abuse or harassment in the classroom in the previous week. And it's really important to stress that these are not marginal issues. This is a signal of a deepening cultural problem that needs urgent and sustained national attention. We're also seeing here in Scotland the rise in racist and xenophobic harm. Again, 2024 research from the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity found that 10% of ethnic minority people in Scotland have recently experienced a racist physical attack. Women of colour, migrant women, and asylum-seeking women face higher levels of targeted harm, but are less likely to report it. And so when marginalised groups are targeted, women and girls always experience the most acute impacts. And another key issue is that Scotland continues to miss key targets on tackling poverty, as seen in the Poverty and Inequality Commission's latest report, which highlights that Scotland missed the 2023 to 2024 interim child poverty target, and around 220,000 children, which is 22%, live in relative poverty, with even higher rates amongst lone parents, disabled families, and minority ethnic households. The Commission is clear. Poverty is gendered, and we need better intersectional data, expanded childcare, and policies specifically tailored to the needs of women facing multiple inequalities. So we as an advisory council, we firmly believe that bolder action is both possible and necessary. A national focus on eradicating poverty and inequality, led by the needs of women and marginalised communities, would benefit the whole of Scotland. And in our current climate, where there's a rise of toxicity, this incremental change is simply not enough. As this political division grows, so too does the harm experienced by the most marginalised, which is why precisely an intersectional, feminist, anti-oppressive approach must be embedded throughout policymaking, service delivery, and government systems. As it's already been emphasised, it cannot be optional. It is essential for creating a safer, fairer Scotland for everyone. With that, we warmly welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to delivering an equality strategy for women and girls, which has been one of the Advisory Council's key calls to action throughout Phase 2. Scotland needs a coherent, ambitious strategy that goes beyond warm words and delivers real, practical change for all women and girls. The urgency is heightened by global rollbacks on women's rights, particularly for women of colour, migrant women, Muslim women, and LGBTQI communities. At a national level in Scotland, we have seen setbacks in areas central to women's rights and equality. For example, the pause on the Human Rights Bill, the decision not to bring forward the Misogyny Bill, and the Gender Pay Gap Action Plan being absorbed into a narrower Fair Work Plan. And we've also identified a broader trend of women-specific inequalities becoming less visible, subsumed within generic equality frameworks, which weakens the intersectional analysis and reduces impact. Throughout Phase 2, the Advisory Council has prioritised accountability by tracking the Scottish Government's progress on recommendations and assessing responses to issues like the cost of living crisis. And while there has been progress, it hasn't moved at the pace or depth that we believe is required. External accountability mechanisms also need strengthening through more accessible processes, empowered advisory bodies, and sufficient capacity inside government to respond meaningfully. The commitment to a long-term equality strategy for women and girls is a hugely positive step forward, but ambition must be matched with structures that ensure delivery. So, with stronger accountability, clearer leadership, and a commitment to intersectional practice, Scotland can and must deliver real, lasting change for women and girls. Thank you for listening. I'll now pass back to Anna, who will introduce the Empowering Women panel.
Thanks very much, Amanda. I'm now delighted to introduce the Empowering Women panel, who will be discussing their experiences of working with us at National Advisory Council and the Scottish Government during Phase 2. So over to you.
Well, good morning, or should I say almost afternoon. Today I've been asked to reflect on our lived experience and work that is good participation really looks like, our journey and why this matters. The project has been a big part of our lives over the last 3 years. During that time, we've got to know each other, build strong relationships with members of the National Advisory Council, and worked alongside some champions within the Scottish Government. Like any long-term project, there have been highs and lows. We want to share our experiences honestly so that future lived experience is meaningful for the people involved and genuinely impactful for decision makers. More than stories, one of the most important things to remember is that we are more than just stories. We are real people with intersecting identities, and those identities shape the different challenges that we face every day. We don't want to keep telling our stories over and over and over again if nothing changes as a result. There is an emotional cost to sharing some of the most difficult aspects of our lives, especially when we don't know whether our involvement leads to change. What we want is for officials to spend time with us, talk to us, and most importantly, listen. It's hard when lived experience work feels like a photo opportunity or just a tick box exercise. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. We have important information to share. Information that can make genuine difference. to decision makers and those in power. While our lives may look different from the officials we meet, there is often shared ground and shared experience too. What lived experience panels bring is a picture of life in Scotland that adds depth, colour, and content to the facts and figures. We also have trusted relationships within our communities. Many people don't feel comfortable sharing these experiences directly with decision makers, and lived experience panels can act as trusted peers, helping to bring forward voices that might otherwise go unheard. Thank you.
What made the biggest difference? From our experience, the things that made the biggest difference were thinking about accessibility in the widest sense, not just whether everyone can get into a building, but whether we're using different ways of communicating, such as videos, phone calls, emails, and texts. Using simple and jargon-free language, and taking the time to explain what new terms when they can't be avoided. Providing individual tailored support, because everyone's needs are different and flexibility makes participation possible. Time to prepare, time to reflect, time to speak, especially for those who need longer to share our views. Time to build relationships and trust, including getting to know each other outside of work. This makes a difference to sharing power, building confidence, and including people who are often excluded from these conversations. Knowing what has happened as a result of our involvement, even if it feels small, and being honest when things haven't gone as planned. All of this helps people feel equal, valued, included, and ensures no one is left out.
So here is our advice to the decision makers. We know many of you came into politics to make a difference to the people of Scotland. So we want your work to be meaningful, and you want value for money. If we could offer one piece of advice to decision makers who want to work with lived experience, it would be this: trust people and include them from the very beginning of the process. It's important to remember that people outside of politics are more than capable of making informed decisions or even taking the lead. You will know from what you've heard from the National Advisory Council earlier about our work with the gender strategy team over the past year. We put in a lot of time and effort to give our own views and to gather the opinions of people within our families and communities. These are unique perspectives that the Scottish Government would not have heard otherwise. Therefore, we are extremely disappointed to hear that the planned vision and goals document is now not being published before the election. We held on to the proposed publication and launch as an indication of commitment from the Scottish Government to gender equity. We know that there are reasons for the delay, both political and practical, but we still hope that the work we did will not be scrapped completely. We will be following progress closely. Thank you.
Closing reflections. It's been a privilege to be part of the Empowering Women panel. We want the work that we've done over the last 3 years. We hope that this happens in the last 3 years. If we were to leave you with one final reflection, it would be this. It's about time, because this type of project only works when everyone involved is able to give it. It takes time from officials to attend events, to sit in the room with us, to actively listen. It takes time to support organisations like Sleeping Giants to create conditions that make participation possible by offering support, guidance and space for people to take part meaningfully. When time is given by all sides, trust grows, relationships deepen, and lived experience work becomes more than consultation. It becomes true collaboration. Thank you for listening.
I'm Talia Yakub. I'm one of the co-chairs alongside Anna, the National Advisory Council, coming to the end of this phase. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Shabna Begum, who is the CEO of the Runnymede Trust. There's a very, very important reason why we reached out to Shabna to be able to engage in this conversation and to be able to talk to you all who are joining us today. We exist in a political and social environment that is becoming increasingly toxic, particularly for marginalised women and girls, specifically women of colour, migrant women and Muslim women within that. And what we are seeing is the normalisation and permission of increasing racism, sexism and misogyny, as has been discussed in some of the questions that were asked to the Cabinet Secretary and Minister just a moment ago. And we wanted to be able to have some expertise to be able to discuss what is happening across the UK, but also reflecting on what we can do better in Scotland. Whether it is issues that are long-standing, like the pay gap being decidedly worse and higher for disabled women, women of colour, migrant women and Muslim women within that too, or the fact that migrant women are at the worst intersections of policy design, like no recourse to public funds, and what consequence that has for marginalised women, migrant women fleeing domestic abuse or violence. Some of this deep inequality, the racism, the misogyny, is threaded into the system as it works now. It's threaded into the system's design right from the beginning. But that is also being exacerbated by the current political environment that is seeing marginalised communities or using marginalised communities as a tool to blame anything from the cost of living crisis to violence against women and girls. This is abhorrent, but it is becoming a pattern, and it is critical that spaces like the National Advisory Council for Women and Girls and spaces like the Scottish Government or local authorities understand the extent of this problem and are unapologetic in transforming systems so they don't replicate these problems as they have been in previous and continued generations and years. So I'm delighted to be able to hand over to Shabna to hear more about her work, the work of the Runnymede Trust, and why it matters so much at this point in the political, social and economic environment. Thank you, Shabna.
Thank you, Talat, and thank you to you and your colleagues for inviting me to speak. It was really interesting just to catch the end of the Minister and the Cabinet Secretary then. So just by way of introduction, the Runnymede Trust is a racial justice charity and think tank. We obviously, as Talat kind of indicated there, we focus on structural and institutional forms of racism and look at how racism is baked into the systems and policies and processes that exist within the UK generally and across our kind of political infrastructure. So my route to Runnymede actually was coming up to 4.5 years ago, where I arrived as a researcher on a particular report, which then, or a particular piece of research, which then became Broken Ladders, which looked at women of colour and their experience of employment here in the UK. And I arrived doing a 6-month research contract, and as part of that was very much focused on looking at speaking with women at various different kind of levels within the workplace and thinking about their experience of the workplace. And what we found from that research back kind of four and a bit years ago now is that 75% of them had experienced some form of direct racism at work. That 61% of them talked about the kind of mental gymnastics as well as the kind of work, the invisible work that they had to do in order to try and mold and fit into workplaces in a way that was acceptable to the wider audiences within them. And we also kind of revealed the well-being, the emotional impact that has on women of colour to be able to navigate those different territories. And that report was my gateway to the Runnymede Trust. I then came into working there full time. And just catching up on the conversation just then as well about the gender pay gap. And again, Talat kind of said it there as well, that the gender and racialized pay gap are intersectional. And we know, for example, that last year when the Gender Pay Gap Day was marked on the 22nd of November, our analysis was able to reveal that actually the gender pay gap for African women would have been on the 24th of October, so much earlier, and for Bangladeshi women would have been on the 16th of September. So we know that women of colour are being underpaid for the same and equivalent jobs, and that relates to the kind of material deprivation and inequality and the poverty, Talat, that you refer to there as well. So these things, we often treat them in isolation, but actually the levels of poverty that are experienced, and family poverty that is experienced, is often related to some of those income gaps that are persistent and are yet to be addressed. But coming back to what you actually invited me to speak about, Talat, I think that the current political context for us at the Runnymede Trust is one where we think that there is an existential crisis for communities of colour, for migrants, for people who have any form of identity that sits outside of what has been defined as the norm. And we are looking at the rise of a far right, which has normalized some of the narratives that we would have a few years ago considered to be repulsive, would not have been able to be kind of talked about in the kind of political spaces and the mainstream media spaces that you currently occupy. So in particular, I think for us as a kind of group here, what I am and what I think we are very worried about is how the language of care for women is exploited to advance this far right agenda. So we've seen everything from kind of the pink ladies, the vigilante groups that have emerged that have tasked themselves with protecting women, protecting children and young girls from asylum seekers, from people of colour, and given themselves kind of the liberty and license to patrol their communities. Patrolling their communities to make who feel safe is obviously deeply questionable. We've seen the Asian grooming gang scandal, where we've got this idea that Muslim men in particular pose a pathological and inherent threat to young women, and all of that has both created the boogeyman, the people that we're able to project all of our animosity and our grievance onto, but it's also obviously distracted from the real perpetrators of violence, as well as to help us to ignore the fact that so much of the violence is perpetrated also by the state and through kind of systemic and institutional processes. So for us, we're really clear around how this language of care for women has been weaponized, exploited to promote a far right agenda, and actually we should consider that to be something that is a danger not only to people of colour, but actually a danger to all of us who consider ourselves as feminists. And I think that there's a wider shift that we've seen as well. So alongside that more aggressive and quite blatant and brutal and quite bolshy kind of projection of we're protecting our women, you've got this other agenda, which is less kind of, which is a little bit more refined in the way it speaks and expresses itself, where we've got the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world talking about like this idea of more having a return to more masculine energy in the workplace, and that we have retreated too far from that. And again, we've seen that perpetrate and kind of colour some of the ways in which we are talking about workplaces. And then, of course, you've got the kind of political class who are talking about this pro-natalist agenda and talking about women and who should be having children and when they should be having them. And obviously, very select effectively applying that pro-natalist agenda, because of course that agenda chimes in with the whole idea of the great replacement theory, who is having too many babies and who's not having enough. So again, deeply racialized, deeply misogynistic ways of thinking about women and our bodies and so on. So I think in the current political context, there's a real muddle of the far right, misogynistic, climate justice. There are so many aspects of all of our progressive agendas that are thrown into this pot, but thrown into this pot to be described as extremist voices on the fringes, when actually we are probably the majority. We are probably the majority, but we just simply aren't making the sonic kind of volume and taking up space in the same way that they do. So I think the current political context is extremely dangerous to progressive, anti-racist, feminist agendas. What does this mean for women of colour? I think that it's quite obvious that in terms of the rise in hate crimes, we've seen a spike in particular of religious hate crimes. And so hate crimes committed toward religious groups, both in the form of anti-Semitism and in the form of hate crimes against Muslim women in particular. And that has been kind of over a long period of time. So we've seen Muslim women who are much more likely to be targeted by that kind of direct individual violence, which is often a symptom of everything else that we've just described. So we know that Muslim women are much more likely to be targeted, but actually coming back to the point around political narratives. So with the Asian grooming gang scandal and that focus on Asian Muslim men, what we saw was actually for the first time in a few years, attacks against Muslim men overtook the number of attacks against Muslim women. Again, this is nationally as a national picture. So political narratives drive what happens in our workplaces, happens on our streets. And more generally, we know that just in terms of the sector and the work that you do, we know that Black and women of colour are much more likely to be victims of domestic homicide. We know they're much more likely to experience discrimination. We know that they're also more likely to endure that kind of abuse for longer periods of time, partly because of access to the services that might meet their specific needs. So I think that we can see that there is a direct impact of those narratives on kind of both the hate crimes that people experience, but also the kind of services and experiences that people are having from the more kind of domestic violence that women might experience. I think that it wouldn't be, I couldn't speak about this without speaking about state violence, and that state violence is access to support for migrant women with no recourse to public funds. That is an active agenda of state violence against migrant women who are subjected to that and who are then often barred from refuge spaces because of all sorts of kind of institutional as well as kind of political obstructions. There's also the state violence around the maternity mortality gap, which continues to persist, even though we've got some commitment to counter that. And of course, there's a state violence of austerity as well, because I think that austerity, whether it's kind of a publicly promoted policy or kind of done by stealth, austerity had and has impacts on women and women of colour in particular. We did a report with the Women's Budget Group, which looked at how much was lost in terms of benefits and welfare to different women, and you can see quite distinctly there the patterns of deprivation that are experienced. So that state violence is the infliction of poverty. It's actively impoverishing women and particularly women of colour. And so I think that from our perspective, what do we need to do? I think for us, we have just announced that we're part of the Together Alliance. We're looking to try and think about how do we mobilise across sectors. There are often so many of us that are fighting these agendas in kind of our silos or in our own spaces. And actually, I think that the nature of the crisis that we face is one that requires us to think about how do we build solidarity? How do we reject the division that the far right would have us believe that actually if you are a supporter of women's rights, then you would want to support this kind of pink ladies, vigilantism agenda. we know that that doesn't support the communities that we serve, the women that we serve. And so really trying to build anti-racist solidarity, but thinking about solidarity across all of our sectors. And I think that from the Scottish Government perspective, I think that it was very interesting to hear some of what was said toward the end there. But what does engagement with women's groups that are led by women of colour look like? What's the funding for these groups? What do we know about their kind of sustainability? So many charities, we're a national charity, we're struggling. How are smaller groups that are being led, that are less visible, less able to access funding, how are they doing? And finally, just a very final point is how we make ensuring that women of colour become the policy makers. So we're not just trying to influence policy, but how do we ensure that the pipelines for women of colour becoming policy makers, how are we ensuring that that is an active and thriving space as well? So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Shabna. That was brilliant. And if we were in an in-person room, you would have had significant applause for everything that you're saying, certainly from me. Your reflections are really important. And if we hadn't had this conversation and we hadn't threaded it across the work that the National Advisory Council for Women and Girls is doing, it would be quite frankly a dereliction of duty from us. The space that we are existing in, even without the worsening political social environment, what you referred to as state violence, and I think it's absolutely correct to call it that. As the First Minister's National Advisory Council of Women and Girls, we have a space of privilege and therefore access to power and influence. And if we weren't to talk about intersectionality, if we weren't to talk about the realities for women of colour, migrant women, disabled women, working class women, single parents who are women, if we weren't to do that, it would be an absolute dereliction of duty. And in many spaces that we're in, too often I'm hearing that intersectionality is a difficult thing to do, or it's something that's on the periphery, or for some it is distracting, or it has been called woke in some places that I'm in, which I'm very comfortable being. But the reality, of course, is that if it's not central, then what we are doing is actively ignoring the marginalisation and the state violence caused by policies that fail to deliver for those women. So I see it as co-chair of the National Advisory Council of Women and Girls over this period, that it was my responsibility and duty to give that space, which is why I'm really glad that you were able to join us today. We have questions that have come in from Circle members, where we gave them a few sentences about what you were going to say, but absolutely did not do it justice. But we have got some questions from them nonetheless. So the first question, and I think it's really important to what we've been talking about here, is we saw a burst of activity during the early years of COVID, particularly around the restarting of the Black Lives Matters movement across the UK on so-called bold anti-racism intersectionality efforts. But these have all but disappeared from government spaces, particularly the UK government, but both governments. What do you think needs to change so that these efforts are not just surface level, dependent on political whim?
Yeah, that's such an important question, and I've been reflecting on that a lot actually, just because I'm at the Office Space of Liberty, which is the national kind of civil liberties organisation, and just speaking to the UN rapporteur on protest rights. And so if you think about kind of that post-COVID moment, it was also Black Lives Matter, the murder of George Floyd, and those commitments were made, right? It was both the shocking disparities that were revealed through COVID, both in terms of those first wave kind of mortality rates, as well as BLM. Those things they came together, and they were a moment, and there was commitment, and there was lots of funding, and there was lots of conversation about it. And I think there's been an active retreat from that, and we find ourselves kind of 5-6 years later now, a space where we are facing a Unite the Kingdom rally that's going to happen on the 16th of May, which is predicted to be the biggest far-right demonstration in Europe that's going to happen. So we do find ourselves in a space where there has been a huge regression on this conversation. But I think we need to reach back to our history and to kind of There's a huge archive that shows that every time that there have been progressive movement, there is always the pushback, and it is the almost the natural kind of momentum of things that this happens, and it's up to us to kind of seize this moment. It is up to us in this year. I think there are elections coming up. There are demonstrations planned. We have to think about how do we use the levers of power that we have, the levers of influence that we have, to reset this conversation, because I think from our perspective, the government currently is trying to speak with two voices at the same time, but those two voices are very much in contradiction to one another. So they're talking about social cohesion on the one hand, but then talking about extremism in the very same breath. The two cannot coincide. They're talking about launching the anti-Muslim hate definition, but on the same hand talking about Islamist extremism being kind of the most kind of active threat to the UK. These are two different kind of voices trying to speak at the same time, and we need to mobilize to activate the more progressive voice, to the voice that is talking about strengthening communities. That is the right place to invest both policy energy and funding. So I think all of us have a responsibility, and we operate in different spaces, but we are part of this broader ecosystem, and mapping what are our levers of influence. How do we push to make sure that our voices are heard? And it comes back to what I was saying before, that I do not think that the far right represent the majority view in this country, but they are the loudest, they are the most active, they are powerful, and they are very well funded. And so we have to find a way of countering that with fewer resources in many cases, but actually with more commitment. I think we our values are strong, and what we need is a national government that is going to find its voice and find the singular voice it needs to have on these issues, and to have some vision and values, which is a society, a nation that appreciates our diversity rather than sees it as a threat. And I think that is what is missing at the moment. Like I said, however we can push for that from our spaces is I think, really, really important now.
Quite right. I think it's all about us taking responsibility for whatever space we occupy, whatever platform we're given, and making our voices heard, no matter what insight or privilege we have. There's a question that I think we've got time for one more question. So you mentioned about making sure that women of colour are also in policy spaces, are advocating for themselves rather than being advocated on behalf of. So how do you think the Scottish Government and the third sector could improve on their policymaking and service design to ensure that the most marginalised women can participate, be represented and lead?
Yeah, so I think that, again, there will be so many people on this call who are absolutely much better placed to answer that question, because you're speaking directly with women in communities, in whatever spaces and services they're trying to occupy, or where they are. And I think that the kind of the uniform processes, the universalized services, the universalized approach to trying to design and then deliver services has never worked. But, there is no universal human being. And so being sensitive to and making sure that we are listening and creating those accountability measures and frameworks within our institutions and our spaces, that it isn't the duty of an individual person to champion this within an organization or a space, but that actually institutions and organizations have accountability frameworks that require them to account for who they've engaged with, and that does it reflect the diversity of the communities that they serve. So I think that's the first kind of level. It's obvious, it's a kind of very simple level of interaction and engagement, of ensuring that you are enabling and ensuring that your services speak to the right people. And I think that you create the pipelines through all sorts of different ways. One of the things that I didn't talk about is the fact that I was a teacher for 23 years before I came to the Runnymede Trust. So I made that transition. And again, thinking about how we are speaking to our girls in schools as well. What ambitions do they have, and where do they see themselves, and what role do we play in encouraging young women to see politics as a space that is and should be for them. And I think that currently, if you look at how kind of women in politics and the kind of the treatment of women in politics, particularly women of colour in politics, is and can how harsh and brutal it can be, particularly for women who speak up on progressive causes like Zara Sultana, if we kind of just name check one young woman of colour, it can be a hideous space. And so how do we create a sense of safety for women who want and children, girls, young women who want to go into those spaces? We need to show up in those spaces. We need to as a generation, we owe our younger selves some of that door opening and securing safety for them as well.
Thank you so much. I'm aware of time, but I do intend to invite you up to Scotland soon anyway. So there will hopefully be more opportunities to hear from you. Thank you so much for your insights and your time. I really appreciate it, Shibna.
No, thank you. Thank you for listening and thank you for inviting me. And it was a pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our circle event today. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. The work of the National Advisory Council in this phase and our time as co-chairs was coming to an end. We have a couple of further meetings, but today was our final major event with you. So you'll be maybe asking what happens next. As you may have seen, if you go onto the National Advisory Council website, you can download our most recent report where we also talk about what we think should happen with the National Advisory Council going forward. Crucially, it talks about this forthcoming strategy, what we think needs to happen, why development needs to be prioritised, why that work needs to be competently participatory, co-produced and intersectional in its delivery. And it's got a whole host of challenges and recommendations for Scottish Government, as you would expect. We fully expect that the next stage of the strategy development and the work of the National Advisory Council going forward will be include stakeholder engagement, which I hope you will all, and I anticipate that you will all be invited to engage in, and I hope you will take that up. What is important is that at the core of the National Advisory Council over this phase has been accountability. There is no shortage of recommendations that come to the Scottish Government. What we don't see enough of is follow through, investment and delivery that makes a tangible difference to the lives of women and girls, particularly marginalised women and girls. What we don't see is delivery with the intention with which recommendations were written. And what we need is both investment in prioritisation of investment and political will to be able to make that happen. The National Advisory Council has been taking that accountability work really seriously. And the next phase of the National Advisory Council will do so too. But regardless of that next phase, we also, as individuals, including yourselves who are on the call here, need to take responsibility for the space we occupy and feel like we are able to challenge and hold to account the Scottish Government and indeed any public institution to ensure that recommendations that they've had in front of them for many years are actually implemented, and that they see that there is a public requirement, a public expectation that delivery will happen. I think that's on all of us to be able to do that alongside the National Advisory Council for Women and Girls. And I hope that we can all count on you to do even more of that. I appreciate you're likely to be doing that in your spaces, but wherever possible, advocating for and using that platform to advocate for the recommendations the National Advisory Council has made, and particularly to be allies and deliver for women who are most marginalised in those spaces and most ignored in the delivery of policy, as referred to as state violence by Shibna earlier. Our recommendations for the National Advisory Council going forward is at the discretion of the next government that will be formed after the elections on the 7th of May. As Circle members, you will of course be kept updated, and I hope to see that there's a National Advisory Council going forward, and I hope to see, most importantly, that the strategy is published and that the strategy is bold, ambitious and unapologetic for delivering, particularly for marginalised women across Scotland. It needs to be a strategy that people see and look at and think to themselves that this is something that can make a tangible difference to women's lives. Otherwise, it's just more words on paper. It's all about implementation and accountability, and I hope that National Advisory Council in this phase has shown that that's what we care about, and I'm sure it will continue to do that in its next phase. Secretariat will circulate information about the next phase about the report that we've just published and our recommendations for the next phase to all of you who have attended today. Thank you so much for being part of the National Advisory Council's journey in this phase, and I hope you have an excellent rest of your day. Thank you for participating in our work.